Hello, students. Today we're going to be exploring value. I can color with value. Value is the lightness or darkness of one color. This is an example of a portrait done in value by the artist Jen Mann. She lives in Canada and she likes to create very large-scale portraits. This one, for example, is an excellent example of value because we can see on one side of his face is very light and the other side of his face is much darker. And everything is done in this corally pink color. And it goes from the very darkest tone to the very lightest tone. Tone is the degree of intensity or strength of a color, and value describes the lightness or darkness of a color. Today, we're going to be practicing value, and I'm going to measure, and by measure, I mean I'm going to look at my knuckle to the point of my index finger, and I'm going to make a line. That way I know how to make my rectangle. And then I'm just going to make a line across and a line at the bottom and connect it. And it doesn't have to be the most perfect rectangle. That's not the point of this. And then I'm going to eyeball it, and by eyeball I mean loosely look at and measure, and make little squares about 2 fingers widths wide in my rectangle. So in the end I'll have about 5 squares. And now I'm going to use a dark color on the left, and I'm going to go from left to right. So in my left hand square is going to be my darkest value, and on my right hand side is going to be my lightest value. And value is, again, the darkness or lightness of a color. So I'm going to choose any color I want, and you should choose any color you want. I'm going to go with a light, a raspberry kind of color. And I'm going to start in the darkest square. And I always want to start in the darkest square because it's the most forgiving. It's very hard to go back once you've gone too dark and make it lighter because we're not using paint. You can't just add white. So we're working with crayon on paper, so we can't really add something to make it lighter. We can only ever go darker. So it's easier to start in your darkest square because then you know what value you're working with. If this is going to be your darkest square, it's easier to then go lighter each step of the way. And I'm not making heavy marks. I'm not pressing very hard. I'm holding the crayon very loosely. And I'm taking my time. And I'm gradually making little soft strokes that layer on top of one another. And that's how I'm building up my value. It's not the kind of thing you can rush. You just sort of have to take your time. Now, after I get my first square done, I'm going to move to the next square. And this time, I want it to be just a little bit lighter. I want it to still be a dark value, but not the darkest value. And I'm going to keep moving on as I go along to the next square, which will then be one step lighter. And as I go, I might eyeball it and think, well, now that I have a middle value in, I can go back and make my darks just a little bit darker, because that will give me a greater range of value. So I'm just eyeballing it, which means measuring with your eyes. Now, the lightest tones are the most difficult tones, because you have to hold your crayon very gently and not make dark marks. You have to be very gentle and feather light with your touch. And there you can see that it goes from the darkest shade of raspberry pink to the lightest shade. Now my next one, I'm going to start with a crayon. I'm not going to make a dark outline this time. And I'm going to see if I can replicate or copy that top bar line of squares, but this time without the dark marks. So your assignment for this lesson is to choose 5 colors and make 5 rectangles of value that go from dark to light. And don't be upset if it takes a little bit of practice or you mess up somewhere. Just keep going because we're all just learning and it takes some practice sometimes. If you're doing this at home, please remember to take a photograph of your art and submit it to this assignment.